So we're talking about something that's going to help you. Certainly it's simple, it's more human, doing some of these things and some of the science that you're using here. But we're gonna, and it's smart, it's a good way to keep things active and works well in most organizations. So here's the agenda. We're going to talk about what is and why the PXT Select Job Fit is important. We're going to talk about the costs of a bad hire. It can vary. And certainly the PXT Select, we're going to review the various reports and uses for it. And then we're going to go through kind of an example. Louise is going to hire a project manager and how she does that. So this should be good for everybody. And just kind of kicking it off, we're going to, so we're talking about great organizations. No success begins with hiring the right people. And of course, that's always something that, everybody kind of knows. And it certainly is a challenge right now, getting the right people, even getting candidates to apply. So you want to make sure that you have, the right people getting on the organization. And this is one thing that can help you do that. And you're really using science to help you get the right people. All right. So what helps getting high performers? You want to make sure they're engaged in their work. And you're really looking at their innate talents. The PXT measures things that are permanent in a person, and they really don't change. I've had people ask me, hey, I took it 5 years ago. Should I take it again? Probably not. Not much is going to change. You might get somebody, changing maybe one STEM, maybe from a 7 to an 8 or something, but not much. Okay, and again, I'm going to kind of walk through this kind of quickly because we got a lot of sides we're going to speak to. So anyway, job fit is certainly there's a lot of the 360,000 individuals over 20 years in 14 industries of kind of how this all came together. And it was really the #1 predictor of success. And this is in a Harvard Business Review, and the link is down there at the bottom if you actually wanted to dive into it, talking specifically salespeople in that article. But just know that job fit is the #1 predictor of success. And that's a good thing since you guys basically use this. But only 5% of organizations feel they have the best in class hiring process in place. And so maybe you're not alone, but if you're using this now, you're probably one of the 5%. 1 in 5 new hires, they determined it's been a bad hire, right? So hiring managers, according to hiring managers on their team. And why does this happen? Too many organizations make critical hiring decisions based on impressions, background, resume, and interview, which is good, rather than data. Now you want to use those things, but if you're using a PXT in addition to those other things, the PXT should only be 1/3 of the ultimate decision to hire or not, or promote somebody. But continue to use all those other things because those are good. So what are the risks of a poor hiring decision? You get your reputation, employee turnover, there's all kinds of things, increased cost. It's frustrating, low productivity and performance, dissatisfied customers, clients, internal people, working with others, low team morale. So what is the cost of a bad hire? You've probably seen some of these numbers before. U.S. Department of Labor estimates that 30% of the first year's earnings. So even if it's an entry-level person at say whatever $30,000, that's $9,000 mistake if you hire somebody that doesn't work out. And this Jorgen Sundberg, which is a recruiting firm, they determined that the cost of onboarding incorrectly is $240,000. Zappos, $100 million annually. So again, cost of bad hire can be significant. So the little bit of money that you're spending on a PXT can certainly help you long run. And I'll be glad to help you anytime if you want to kind of get some specific numbers to give to somebody that would be interested in that. Okay, so what's the cost of a mediocre hire? So I don't know if you've seen many of my presentations before, but I've used Ben before. So Ben's a nice guy. We're looking at hiring him. He's had a great resume, impressive background, interviewed well, seemed like a good team player. We hired him, new sales manager. Great. So Ben's on board, although now that he's been there a while, we've kind of starting to see the dark side of Ben. And, what typically that means is that, we find out that he prefers working alone, isn't concerned with performance of others, and he's slow and inaccurate working with numbers and data. What kind of a sales manager is that, right? So anyway, you could have known had you done some things, and we're going to look at more of that in detail. Okay, so adding data to traditional hiring tactics can sound like it's overwhelming. If you haven't been using it, could I get everybody to mute themselves? So that would be helpful. Anyway, by going to something like the PXT and using data, using scientific data as part of your hiring process, but it doesn't have to be a challenge or a problem. Actually, here's the predictors of success, right? So what are they? Technical skills, knowledge of the job, work experience and history, thinking style, behavioral traits, and interests. And that's where we can help, is in those last three, and with the PXT. Okay, so now let's look in a little more detail at the selection process. You certainly, you get all kinds of resumes and you screen them, and then you can give them an assessment, the PXT. Then you go through some interviews, and then ultimately you're going to do some sort of background check, hopefully, do your due diligence, and then place the person. Now that PXT select assessment, it shows it before the interview, but it can be before or after the first interview. Maybe it's after a phone screen. Everybody has a different process. There is no one right way. But, if you're going to be spending time and effort on interviewing somebody, for the cost of a PXT, maybe knowing that this is not going to work out, you can see it sometimes that they're not a good match, and save yourself some time, or certainly even a hiring manager or a team of hiring people interviewing. Okay, but the PXT select assessment would be used somewhere throughout the process. And it gives you equally weighted information. Again, I talked about 1/3 of the results. It should be the assessment, but really no more. So then that's helping you be simple, human, and smart. I'm trying to go with this simple, human, smart theme, right? So when you're trying to get a top performer, what's required to the position? You want to get a performance model. And all of you have had performance models, and I'll be glad to help you with those anytime. There's different ways to do it, and we'll look at those in a minute. Okay, so when we're talking about PAC, your assessment center, and the performance model options, let's look at some of these. Oops, I picked the wrong way. Okay, so there we have a library of jobs, hundreds of jobs already in a library, and they're based on successful people in those jobs. The ONET, which is onetonline.org. We use case studies, Department of Labor databases, and it's validated for selection. So the other thing that we can do is a concurrent pattern. Now, if you're not familiar with a concurrent pattern, it's basically taking at least 3 people, hopefully top performers, and averaging their results to get a pattern, and then you hire to that because those people were successful. But when we're talking about, it's good to have some bottom performers too. Bottom performer, just for lack of a better word, lower performers. And a good way to get this going, if you wanted to get a larger group of people, is ask for volunteers. It's kind of a friendly way. A lot of people will volunteer. And if you force somebody that's already within the organization, they're going to feel kind of singled out. But if they're able to volunteer, it's just more of a friendly way to do it. And it's good to know because a lot of times there might be certain traits that will show, okay, assertiveness, sociability, and decisiveness are all key traits for this particular job. But then we find out that some of the bottom performers also are relatively assertive. Then now that one doesn't quite become as important, but maybe the other two are, because the bottom performers aren't decisive and whatever else is required. So anyway, that's a concurrent pattern. I'd be glad to help you with those anytime, but it basically takes having a bunch of people do it so that you can get some good data. The more, the better. And there's a job analysis survey. It's a 57-question survey that the supervisor usually fills out. It only takes 5 minutes, and it helps kind of tweak the benchmark. Plus, you're getting the supervisor involved with the process. And sometimes they're just really happy that they were asked and that they had some input on the actual performance model and how it's going to help hire people in the future. And one thing that we don't talk about too much is there are templates available. So a template is where we put it together, everything that you need to do, and it's just a link that goes out to candidates. They self-register, they take the assessment, and then the reports go to anybody that you set up to get the reports automatically, whether it's just you, or maybe it's the hiring manager, or maybe there's a couple of key people that want to be involved. You can set up a template, and all that's done with just a link that you send out to candidates. Pretty slick. Okay, so moving right along, we're going to talk about what's required for the position, what's required for this performance model. So it's basically a measure of the candidate's thinking style, behavioral traits, and interests. But we want to get it to match so that it really helps with their job fit. And some of the things we just talked about, the library patterns and concurrent things, are what we can do to do that, use that. Okay, so now let's look at some of the actual data. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. This could be a whole nother hour presentation. You know, when we're looking at what does it mean for verbal skill? What does high and low mean? And all the others. So we're just going to kind of touch on this briefly, but because I really want to get to some of the reports that are available here in a few minutes. But anyway, we're talking about thinking style, which is basically verbal skill, verbal reasoning, numeric ability, and numeric reasoning, the 4 different cognitive pieces that are measured. You ultimately get a thinking style. And if they're high in thinking style, that basically means that they pick things up quickly. If they're in the middle, then they might be a little bit challenged with some of a training program. And if they're on the lower end, that doesn't mean they're not smart. It just means it takes them a little bit longer to get it. So that's kind of what the overall thinking style. And it uses the verbal skill, which is how you measure vocabulary. So the definition of words, and it gets increasingly difficult. And then there's also verbal reasoning, which is word problems, right? Which is good to have. And numeric ability, which is like adding big numbers, kind of dividing things in your head and being able to do some of those things. Some people are quite good at that. Some aren't. And you don't particularly need to be for every job. And then numerical reason, where it uses kind of number problems and different ways of solving problems. So why is this important? Because all jobs require some sort of problem solving skills. So that's why the thinking style is a big part of the whole assessment. And there are other assessments out there. And one of them that I do is DISC, right? Now, those aren't valid for hiring, but they are good for career planning. But there's no, you know, you don't really look at anything as far as cognitive ability, thinking style. All right, let's look at behavioral traits. So these are work-related preferences and behaviors in these 9 different areas. So pace, it basically means is how quickly somebody likes their day. If they're high in pace, they're able to multitask and have a day that a lot of things are going on, answering the phone, fires to put out and all those kinds of things. Somebody that's low on pace is, I don't know, more, they're steady performer. They prefer kind of making a to-do list and getting one done and then number 2. And sometimes they'll never leave their office because they're working on things. So that's pace, high or low. And keep in mind that on a scale of 1 to 10, 4 through 7 is going to be about 2/3 of the people out there, 66%. Most people are going to be in the middle of 4, 5, 6, or 7. And that's the same with all of these traits because we're using a normative curve to measure these things. All right, so assertiveness, pretty self-explanatory. Somebody that's high in assertiveness is forceful, and on low end, they're not so assertive. They're a little more unassuming. Sociability, pretty self-explanatory. Outgoing on the high end of sociability, more reserved, and on the low end. But it's certainly, all these things are job specific. Some jobs require a little higher sociability and many don't. So conformity, and that's really, do they kind of follow the rules, is a quick way to put it. Or if on the other end, it doesn't mean they're not a rule breaker, it's just they're more strong-willed in some cases. And then outlook. Are they very trusting? I'm very high in Outlook, and I'm almost to the point of naive in some cases. But that's what somebody that's on the high end of Outlook, they're very trusting. And on the other end, they're very skeptical. And you probably know people like that. And actually, you want your maybe accounting type people, CFOs, safety people to be a little bit more lower in the skeptical. And actually, you probably want them a little bit lower in the next one too, decisiveness. They're more deliberate in their decisions. Sometimes they'll take forever, but people that are high in decisiveness, like me, are willing to accept the available risk and make their decision and move on. That's kind of what it means for high in decisiveness. But again, keep in mind, most people are in the middle, which is a good thing. Accommodating. Are they agreeable, sometimes too agreeable, or on the other end, they're steadfast, they hold to their thoughts. Independence, they're they're able to go out and do things that they need to do. They don't rely on a supervisor too much. If they're low in independence, they're probably going to ask their supervisor a lot of questions. But again, most people are in the middle, so that's where you kind of were. In most cases, some of these cases, that's where you want them. Okay, judgment. This is how people make decisions, mostly on facts if they're on the high end of judgment, and the more gut feel, intuitive if they're on the low end. Okay, so there we just reviewed those quickly. And like I said, I could go into a whole long program with this. And I'll be glad to do that with any of you anytime if you want to go that. I've got different programs where we can look at that. Okay, now let's look at interests. It measures the degree of interest in these 6 different areas. And if somebody doesn't have the interests for a particular job, like salespeople, you'd probably want them enterprising. And certainly enterprising people are, they like to network and negotiate and do all those kinds of things. Go out and do presentations. If you've got somebody that's high in enterprising on your team, they're the one that you probably want to assign maybe to go out and do presentations to groups. Creative, that is an interesting one, and it's not too job specific very often, but most people will have some sort of creative streak. If it's their number 1 or 2 interest, then they might be good in some sort of marketing position or something where they need to be creative, or they'll get their creative interests satisfied after work or on the weekends. They're going to art shows, they're doing something interesting like that, creative. Now, the financial administrative, certainly financial, you can understand that, but the administrative part of this, that's important. That's where you want people that are going to get their paperwork turned in on time, do the reports that you want, they do these administrative tasks well. People service is somebody that's maybe in social work or some sort of position like that. Certain doctors, you probably want, I'm guessing, more like a general practitioner, high in people service, where maybe the surgeon is, let's go in and, get this done. And they aren't too good with the bedside manner sometimes. So people service maybe isn't important for them. Mechanical, this can be anything, like just kind of understanding how machines work. Also includes gardening. If somebody likes to garden, they're probably going to be high in mechanical. And then technical certainly is important depending on the job. And that means that somebody likes to do the research. They'll get all those things done. They're probably a C in the DISC profile. They like all the detailed stuff. Okay, so that's just kind of touching on those a little bit. And this gets back to Ben. So what was Ben doing? So we didn't know he was slow and inaccurate working with numbers, and wasn't concerned about others, and actually prefers working alone. So it's some of those traits we learned can help. All right, now let's look at Louise. We're gonna go through the process. Louise is gonna hire a project manager. So let's kind of see how we can use some of these things in this process. She uses a role-based selection process, which includes a lot of things, and that's basically she follows our program here. Ultimately gets a lot of people, screens their resumes, and then generally you maybe take the top 3 to 5 candidates and have them take the PXT, and you can use that by setting it up through the PAC, or sending them a template where they just click on the link and self-register and take the assessment, and the reports go out to you. Okay, so here's a video. This is what This is what candidates see. If you haven't seen this before, this is what candidates see before they take the PXT. So it kind of helps explain a few things.
Invited to take a PXT Select assessment. When organizations take the time to match people with jobs that will bring out their best potential, everyone wins. That's why you're here. PXT Select will help you share your work-related behaviors, interests, and problem-solving abilities. That's right, there's going to be some math and some vocabulary. All jobs require some form of problem-solving. That's the reason for these questions. Don't worry if some seem difficult. The assessment is designed to measure the upper range of a person's numerical and verbal ability. No matter who you are, some of these questions will challenge you. Feel free to use a calculator if you wish, but please don't use any other outside assistance like the internet or your high school math teacher. This is not a pass or fail test. It's about understanding the fit between you and a role. You will also answer some simple questions about yourself and your interests. When responding to these questions, it's important to be yourself. There is no time limit for taking PXT Select. Most people set aside an hour, but feel free to complete it at your own pace. If you need to step away, don't worry. Your work will automatically be saved if you exit the assessment before you're finished. But be sure to remember your password so you can log back in with ease. Thank you for taking the time to complete PXT Select.
So everybody you set up to take the PXT sees this video before they get started on the questions and answers. And it helps. It kind of puts them at ease. And it's just a good video. It's a well done video. So thought I'd show it to you.
Welcome.
Okay, so moving right along, let's look at what adaptive testing is. That's part of the PXT Select uses adaptive testing. Now, what does that mean? So responses are calculated based on the candidate's responses. Questions are determined by the candidate's responses, and I'll show you how that works. But the advantages of adaptive testing, you get a better assessment experience and more accurate results. So how does this work? So you looks at the cognitive, behavioral, and interests. Those are the three areas that we look at. And adaptive testing is used in the cognitive, the behavioral, but not in the interest section, because that's their interest. You can't really score that quite the same way. Okay, so kind of how this works is there's different levels of questions, right? And it always starts off with a kind of a middle, moderate type of question. And then from there, if they get it right, they make it a little harder. If they get it wrong, they make it a little easier. So it keeps going through until they settle on where their actual, abilities are. And, I guess when you're talking to people, you certainly want to tell them, okay, if you're kind of giving a before little talk, you could say, okay, make sure you be yourself. Because, if you aren't a good fit for this role, there might be something that we could put you into in another position. So be yourself. It's just kind of a good way to do that. So anyway, it measures all these things and ultimately gets better results. Shorter tests, same precision and greater precision, actually. Okay, so a little more about adaptive testing. It's a simple online experience, better assessment experience for the candidate, and smart, more accurate measurements. There you go. Now, let's start looking at some of the reports, and there are a lot of reports. Everybody uses the selection report. That's the most common, and we're going to spend the most time on that, but there are others for the participants and even for onboarding and development. So we're going to break this out into three sections, probably spend the most time on the selection because that's really what it's due for PXT Select, right? Whether you're hiring somebody new in the organization or promoting somebody within, or succession planning, using some of these things for that. You'll see how that works. And all these reports are included. There's no extra cost for any of this. Once somebody takes it, you can match them to different benchmarks and all these other things. So we're going to look at the comprehensive selection report. There's a sales version for that just has sales talk. Multiple candidates report where you have a group of candidates, maybe the top 5 you're assessing for this particular job, and it ranks them in percent match order. multiple positions report, you see how we use that for succession planning. And then the leadership report really has some good information and good interview questions, especially if you're going to be in a leadership position or some future leadership position. Okay, so let's start with the individual feedback. Oh, let's talk about the participant reports first before we do that. There's an individual feedback report, there's a sales version, and then there's an individual's graph. And these are kind of used for onboarding and developing. We use the coaching report, the sales coaching, manager, employee report, and the team report. So you'll see a little bit about each of these so you have a good understanding of what they're used for. Okay, now let's look at the comprehensive selection report. Okay, so here we've got a particular individual. We're looking at the comprehensive selection report. It measures one person, one position, right? There's others that do more than that. And you get a kind of summary information, performance model, data, and then interview questions. So let's start looking at it. The introduction tells you what's in this report, what to expect, and kind of a little blurb about distortion. We'll get into that too. Distortion is important. So it kind of sets the context on the first page, and here's what you get. It gives you a good summary, a bit of information. So it looks at the performance model, talks about what that is, and then it gives you whether distortion was detected. So there's only about 1 or 2% of people actually show up with distortion. And that just kind of means that they were trying to polish the apple a little too much. They were maybe not really who they are. They weren't answering questions candidly. So you just have to be a little careful. And you can certainly use some of the questions in there, but it gives you detail on what it suggests not to use. So anyway, distortion is important. If you aren't measuring distortion, you don't know if you've got a good, valid report. But in the case of this PXT, 90% of the time you do. So distortion was not detected. That means you've got a good, valid report. You can use all the interview questions. Okay, so again, we're setting the context, looking at the basic information in the introduction, and then we're going to get into the selection report. Distortion. I must have hit a back button. It didn't. It took me further back than I wanted to go. Okay, so the results summary. The overall percentage fit is kind of one of the first things you want to look at. In this case, pretty much anything 80% and higher is going to be a good fit. You get in the 70s, and if you get into the 60s, it's going to be a challenge area. And sometimes you'll have to hire somebody that happens to be in the 60s, and you just know it might be a little bit of a project to kind of get them on board. So it looks to the overall fit to the performance model, broken out into the 3 different areas. And each area is important. So the weighted overall fit for the ultimate percentage is varied, and the thinking style is 40% of what goes into the overall fit, behavioral traits 40%, and the interests is only 20%. But keep in mind, if their interests aren't tied in with the job, if they're not a good match in interest, that could be a turnover statistic long term. So those are important too. Okay, so now let's look at some of these things. Let's look at the thinking style. You can see that the green shaded area is the benchmark. That's a performance model. And if they're outside of the performance model, like in this case, verbal skill and numeric ability, they're right next to it. So probably going to be okay. Not really a big problem, but just know that, it can vary, especially when they get quite a ways away. And in this case, this is somebody's pace. You can see that they're a little bit leaning towards the higher in pace. They're more urgent, driven, fast paced. That's the way they like their day. And if they're on the low end, they're more patient and good with routine, and that's how they like their day. It gives you more information on so the OC are the initials of the candidate, and then there's the benchmark. So those are the things that you're looking at. So in this case, the last one down there, the judgment, they're a little bit further away. So they're more of a factual based decision maker, and which is okay. But in this case, you can see that outlook, they're a little skeptical, which probably won't be a problem. They're a high percentage match. It's just kind of giving you a heads up, but their interests are up there too. So they're in pretty good shape. The performance model for this particular job, though, asks for creative, people, service, and enterprising. And on the left, you can see Oliver's actual interests are technical, creative, and financial, administrative, and the rest. It's in rank order, so top to bottom. Okay, so now let's look at a little bit more detail at what we're measuring. In this case, verbal reasoning. So Oliver Chase is in the middle. He's a 6, which is, quite in the middle. It gives you what it means to be on 1 through 3, what it means to be a 4 through 7, and what it means to be an 8 through 10. So it gives you a lot of detail. And a lot of times people just look at that first page, what percentage match are they? And then they go right to page 8, which is the interview questions. But in this case, we're giving it a little bit more detail, tells you what the ideal candidate is like, and that in this case, Oliver fits the performance model. So good. Move on to the next one where maybe might be more of an issue. So it's looking at the different scales that are being measured. The ideal candidate description is in there. And there's just a lot of information, and some people use more than others. Once you get to using them quite a bit, you kind of go to what works for you, and that can vary. And again, it's talking about the interests are 20%, but still 20% of the overall fit is important. Here's a definition of all 6 interests, and that's good to know, certainly for everybody. And if somebody was watching this presentation on the recording, they could pause it here and get a lot more information. We have a quick reference guide to help people that are reading the reports and maybe using it for the first time. So that's good to have. We've got a couple other reports that we'll talk about too in a little bit. So this is one of them. So the report guide has information on the PXT Select, why you use it, all the what it means to be more detail on distortion, and then more detail on all the various reports. So the PXT Select report guide is a good one to have, and certainly share with anybody that's going to be using this. Of course, then they have to actually go through it too. So now let's look at the sales version of the comprehensive selection report. Has some different information in there. Talks to sales language. It looks at critical sales practices. So if you have salespeople in your organization, or maybe new business development, or whatever you're calling it, that's where you want to use the sales report. Because looking at these critical sales practices, you'll see how that works in a minute. But again, it's all sales context. And it describes the candidate, how they might use those particular things. So now let's look at what the critical sales practices are. What are they in prospecting, initiating contact, building and maintaining relationships, closing sales? So it looks at all this different information and gives them a little read on each candidate, their salesperson. So wouldn't this be helpful for a sales manager, for his sales team? And so it's in there. It's in the sales version of the comprehensive selection report. So here's a little bit more detail on prospecting. You can see that you'll probably be effective in this particular position, but that third bullet, unwilling to identify key prospective clients if he lacks the ample data. So it gives you some good information. And when we get to the coaching report, there will be areas in there where it helps the supervisor coach their people. So in this case, it does a lot of things right, but this particular one, the unwilling to identify key prospective clients if it lacks, doesn't have enough data. Okay, so maybe we're working with this and find that So in Louise, in her process of hiring somebody, gives you more information. When you're scheduling interviews with the 3 to 5 candidates or whatever you're using for this particular open position, you get personalized interview questions. And if you knew that a lot of people are coached to answer interview questions, and sometimes you'll ask them an interview question and they never answer the question because they're coached to make sure you talk about these things. But anyway, in the interview questions, there's the top 3 challenge areas, right? So in this case, it tells you, okay, listen for this. And, when you're doing an interview, sometimes, you can get, stay on track with some of this information. So in this case, the person's more factual than the performance model asks for, bases decisions on behaviors and data. And so you want to listen for certain things, and it gives you some things to listen to in there. So it's just really helpful when you're doing the interviewing. Okay, so what are the next thing it looks at is the areas of strength. And in this case, it's a whole page on areas of strength. In this case, verbal reasoning and some of the other things, and it gives them the same information as the challenge areas where they're outside of the benchmark. And then the remaining scales are in the follow-up pages too. So they're all kind of there. And you're not going to ask all these interview questions, but you'll certainly probably highlight a few that you want to hit on. And that's how to use this interview report. Okay. As this says, organizations kind of lack a standard interviewing process. They're 5 times more likely to make a bad hiring decision. So by having some sort of process, like using the PXT as part of the hiring, that's going to make it much more effective when you're hiring the right person. So let's get back to Louise and her candidates. She's using tailored interview questions to make the interview process more effective. How would you use these interview questions to improve your interview process? Using the PXT report can help you avoid a bad hire, right? So in the report guide, it gives you, again, all kinds of information. So now let's look at one of the other reports that's handy, and it's the multiple candidates report. And this is where you've got your top 5 candidates or whatever the number are, and you can see their results on one page and what percentage benchmark match they are. So this might help you kind of zero in on a couple, 2 or 3 of the ones you want to really look at. So that's what the multiple candidate report helps you do, with all kinds of extra data. So if you're doing any sort of succession planning or career pathing, the multiple position report is the one that you want to use. And you'll see how that works because you're using multiple positions and comparing them to one person. And so here's an example of jobs in your organization, and this particular candidate is an 88 to 79%, so really pretty high percentage match for all the positions. Normally, if you've got a wide variety, or maybe you're trying to fill a key management role of some sort, you'll see where they match with all the other jobs. And you can see how this would work with succession planning. Who's going to be the best fit for a particular position that's going to open up in 3 months? Who might we want to consider internally before we go outside to look at other people? So it gives you a good basis of information in this multiple positions report and what kind of overall fit they are for the different roles that you're looking at. And maybe they're brought in for one particular job, but they're a high percentage match for something else. Or the other thing it's used for is a redeployment. Somebody isn't working out in a particular position. They're a good employee. You want to keep them, but they and their boss just aren't getting along. What other job can we move them into? That's where that report can be helpful. Okay, so now let's look at the leadership report. And it gives you a lot of information. It doesn't actually give the person numbers, but it puts them in a range, and it tells them where they're at and gives them all that same summary data on thinking style, behavioral traits, and occupational interests. So the leadership skills that it looks at are creating a vision, developing strategies. These are the 6 foundational things: creating a vision, developing strategy, ensuring results, And then under people, are they inspiring people, being approachable and mentoring others? So, and we're just going to look at one of these in a little more detail. And with this one, what it measures are and how it gets this creating a vision is used as their decisiveness, their judgment, and their creative results. And ultimately, you're able to get what their strengths are, what some challenges are, and then it gives you information and interview questions. That's why this is part of the hiring process, is because there's some really good interview questions, certainly for leadership of the future or currently. Okay, so same listen to statements, and then ultimately she's going to hire somebody, right? So you're hired, and then now what? So now we're going to onboard this person, and there are some significant statistics out there that onboarding is key to retention, and if the onboarding process isn't done right, that can be a challenge long term. So let's use some of these reports in the hiring process, the onboarding process. We're going to look at the individual feedback report, the sales version, and then the individual graph. And so those are three things that are used. And again, it's written to the candidate. It's bullet points, specific information. There's no numbers. This individual's feedback report is something you want to give to current employees if you're having them take the assessment for promotion or for helping set a benchmark or something. It's kind of safe. It's positive information about the candidate, and they almost always agree with everything in there because it's positive information and there's no scores. So you can see where, it kind of almost pumps them up a little bit, and it can be very beneficial in the whole onboarding process. How did I do in my, I know I took a test. How did I do? So it gives them information about themselves and can be helpful even with some career development stuff. And then, of course, there's a sales version, which talks sales talk. Now, the individual graph's a little bit different too. It puts them, it doesn't, you don't see, it kind of shows where they're at. And my recommendation before you give them this, you want to kind of tell them what it means to be high in pace, what it means to be low in pace, and some of the other traits. And also that most people are between a 4 and a 7. If you just kind of glance at that, it's kind of middle, in this case, a little higher in most of those traits. So understanding how it's put together can be helpful. Okay, so Louise is now going to eventually be doing some coaching with her new employee. It helps the employee's productivity, improves retention, and increases engagement. And of course, and we're going to just touch on again why we do this, why we do coaching and things, because engagement is so important. Disengagement can be very costly, as you can see by some of these numbers here. Okay, so she wants to make sure that Oliver is successful in his new role. So we're going to look at the coaching report, the sales version, the manager employee report, and then the team report. Let's start with the coaching report. Again, one person, one position, and it's really, this is designed for only their supervisor. This isn't something you give them to help them become a better employee, because it's written to their manager. And there you see where the scores are on the summary graph. And so it starts off with what you need to know about Oliver. Gives you some bullet point information about Oliver. And these management tips are really the key to the coaching report. Certainly in any areas that the person is outside of the benchmark, you want to work on those management tips as a supervisor. That's where you want to go, where they're outside the benchmark and the management tips. Can be very helpful. Gives you some bottom line information. And then, of course, the sales version is all talking related sales talk. All right, let's switch to the manager employee report. And we're winding up towards the end here. We probably got another 5 or 6 minutes, so we're going to be done before the hour. So the manager employee report is kind of designed for the manager only. And sometimes there's challenges for a manager and then one of their employees working together. This can help save a relationship just because it helps the manager, points out some things, why they're so similar or so different, and it can help them smooth out some differences. Or as a last step, this isn't going to work. I tried everything there is. And of course, as you know, at least in Michigan here, it's a at-will state, which means you can fire anybody for any reason at any time. And this is kind of a last effort to help you determine if this is somebody you want to keep or not. And before you do, certainly let somebody go, you want to have all kinds of data. You want to have some documentation on why you're doing that. Anyway, it looks at behavioral scales only. So in this case, you're both relatively middle, lower on the sociability. And it gives you information on how to work better as the manager, work better with your person. So as you can see here, it gives you some detail, pretty good information. So that's what the manager employee does and what your tendencies are compared to Oliver's, and things to consider doing some next step stuff, and then a summary and reflection of the overall report. Okay, let's look at the team report, which is a great report for management teams, sales teams, departments, or maybe an entire facility somewhere else. You know, you're able to look at the whole shop floor or management team at a factory or whatever you're looking at. Maximum 25 people, basically really only looks at the behavioral scales, and it's written to each person. So when you create this for maybe 5 or 10 people, each person gets their own report and it talks to them about working with people on their team. So it can be very helpful, tells you where you are and then where some of the team members are in relation to you, which is certainly, it can be helpful on any team. So you can see what the whole pace of the team is like, and you're even able to ultimately see where the average, you can see like on this one, where the average nationally is. You can see that's that white line is kind of the average, well, it's the middle, and you're a little higher than the average or a little lower, and that's what that'll tell you. Okay, so again, we're kind of wrapping up here, and we're looking at all the different reports that are included with the PXT Select. They're all available to use for reflection or for selection, for all the participant reports, for onboarding and things, and development. So they're all there. Whether you use them or not is up to you, and it's just a good mixture of reports. So let's just talk briefly in the end here about performance model validation. It meets all the standards. It's basically bulletproof. It meets all of the protected classes, and it's certainly the Department of Labor, all their things. So the reliability and validity is detailed in the PXT Select research report. And that's probably, I don't know, for 60 or 80 pages. If you want that, let me know. For anybody that's certainly that detailed type person, it might be worth looking through. It gives you a lot of data on the validity and reliability. So ask for those if you want them, and the report guide and the quick reference guide. Be glad to send those out if you don't already have them. Okay, so now again, we looked at Ben, wrapping it up here. We could have known that he wasn't a good fit, and using the PXT. So you're going to use the PXT to select to make smart hiring decisions. And for any of you, and I don't think really too many of you on this call really use the Profile XT, which was before Wiley bought Profiles International. We had what was the Profile XT, and they kind of spruced it up a little bit. Now it's the PXT Select. But if you have some Profile XT employees out there, they can convert in about 5 minutes worth of questions to a PXT Select, and then you can create more management team or sales team reports or some of those. So that kind of wraps it up for me. We've done this in under an hour, and helps you be able to use some things that make it simple to use, more human, because you're touching people in many different ways and learning about them, and ultimately smart. So that last line under the chairs there, I'm just going to throw this out there. Some other assessments besides the PXT. The Step 1 survey is a 15-minute pre-employment only, measures substance abuse values, reliability, work ethic, and integrity. Good assessment, a lot less expensive, kind of like, do I want to consider this group of 5 or 10 people, give them a Step 1 survey. And then the Checkpoint 360, you're familiar with what 360s do. This one's well done. I've done hundreds of these, probably approaching thousands. But anyway, our Checkpoint 360 is well done. And then we have a customer service profile, which is specifically for customer service or call center type people, measures tact and empathy and some different things, very similar to how the PXT works. So that kind of wraps it up for me. That's the end of the presentation. Let me know if I can help you with anything that you saw in here. And I'll send